This was my favorite chapter when I probably started into corporate finance. You have to understand the time value of money chapter was handled separately back in the old days. And so this topic was one of my favorites in this particular course because it allowed me to come up with the right answer. And any decision criteria that helps me decide on the right answer, in my way of thinking, is really great. And I realize, because I'm older and wiser now, that that may not sit well with everybody, but this one is really a nice decision criteria because of that. And we're going to end up with enough, how can I put this, wrinkles on this decision-making process toward the end of the chapter and then in chapter 11 that anybody who needed extra wrinkles to come up with a decision, you'll probably get it from all of the above. And that's okay with me as well, but as long as we get a really strong decision criteria out of this. First off, what do we mean by capital budgeting? Capital budgeting is the planning and evaluation of expenditures on assets whose cash flows are expected to extend beyond a year. So for buying new equipment, whether it's a desk or a computer or whatever, any asset whose cash flows are expected to extend beyond a year, we need to analyze using capital budgeting. Now, a desk doesn't by itself generate cash flows in, and so maybe we're going to bypass that one. But any production equipment is going to have with it maintenance and a whole bunch of other things associated with it, which means that it may actually have cash flows that go on beyond a year. And depending upon the type of equipment, it may have maintenance. There are cash flows that may extend beyond the initial purchase, and that's what we're trying to capture here. Any purchase of long-lived assets could be justified by the techniques discussed in this chapter, but primarily those with cash flows associated with them. So before we get into this too far, though, I need to really describe one little piece of jargon. As we go throughout this chapter, I'm going to talk a lot about this project and that project and some other project. When we talk about projects, we're talking about any project. Could be a project, which means a set of cash flows where we're investing in some new project. It could be an expansion of what we're doing. We could buy a new outlet, we could buy a new franchise, we could buy a new whatever we're investing in is called a project. It can be as simple as one piece of equipment. It could be as complicated as buying a competitor, acquiring a competitor. That could be a project. So when we talk about project, it's rather loose, but it's rather loose on purpose, because then we can convey a lot more information. The same procedure is followed to analyze those purchases to make sure that we're maximizing shareholder wealth, and that's really the point of capital budgeting. If you're going to be buying long-lived assets with associated cash flows, we need to analyze them appropriately. Projects can only be justified if the purchase is expected to enhance shareholder wealth, if the value of the firm will increase due to adoption of this project. To rationally analyze project adoption, financial projections are generally made for the project. We've done financial projections thus far for our company, but we would actually look at projecting the cash flows for individual projects, which is the focus, by the way, of Chapter 11. Often these financial projections are full-blown pro forma financial projections like those we did for the entire firm in Chapter 12. So if we're doing a plant expansion, or we're expanding into a new country, for instance, or we're buying up a subsidiary, establishing a subsidiary, or buying out a competitor, those are huge decisions, and those financial projections are going to look quite similar to those in Chapter 12. If they're just buying a piece of equipment, they might not. And then we'd look at Chapter 11 stuff. Capital budgeting projects tend to fall into several different categories, and I'm going to talk through these partly because the criteria that we'll use, we'll say general things about them, and I want to begin to say, well, yeah, but. And so here we go. The first one we're looking at is we might be looking at replacing either equipment or building or something for our current profitable operation. If we're considering that, the question is, should we replace or should we keep what we currently have? In those instances, we would usually be looking for, if this adds to shareholder wealth, then we should adopt it only if the marginal improvement is positive. And we'll set these up in such a way so that we will get marginal cash flows, and then say if the marginal cash flows tend to give us a positive increase, I know that's kind of redundant, but an increase in the value of the firm, we should replace that equipment or building or land or whatever. Second, if we're replacing to reduce costs, again, we can do a marginal analysis. We can say what would be the marginal cash flows. And at that point, again, we're trying to maximize shareholder wealth. So as long as some of these criteria are positive enough, or positive at all because they're marginal, then we should replace the equipment. Expansion of existing products or markets. If we're expanding the existing product line, we're expanding within an existing market, opening up a new outlet or what have you. These are things that we already know, but we would still want to maximize our shareholder wealth, therefore get the highest positive that we can get out of this. Expanding into new products or markets. This one might be with an acquisition of a competitor who, instead of, in my instance, the Rocky Brands was Rocky Shoe and Boot Company, but really has a lot of boots. But if we wanted to expand into new products, say belts or suspenders or something else, we'd have to look at that from scratch and see what that would do for us. And by the way, that is something that they did expand into, as a matter of fact, is other clothing. Contraction decisions. In these instances, the question is, do we do what we're currently doing, or do we get rid of certain product lines or certain geographical locations? It's just the opposite of the expansion decision. And again, if we set this up as a marginal, what are the marginal cash flows? We can actually look at this and say, does it add to value or does it subtract from value? Safety or environmental projects. And in this instance, and we could expand this one on our list. This list primarily comes from our current textbook. But I would add an extra line here, which is certain costs. There are times when we are just looking at certain costs. The question is, how do we get this to be as small as possible? Safety and environmental projects, when we're looking at these, they're usually just costs. They don't add value to the firm, but we're constrained. We have to do them. And therefore, our question is, do we do this project or that project? Which one will maximize our shareholder wealth? In those instances, we might actually you can do it in one of several ways. You can get a base project and then say what would be the marginal adjustments. But usually you just look at 2 or 3 different options and you choose the one with the highest positive impact on the value of the firm. Now, since all of them are negative, you're finding the one that's the least negative, if that makes sense. So if you're looking at a number line that goes from negative infinity to positive infinity, you're doing the one that's the furthest right on that continuum. 7, mergers. Should we merge? Should we not merge? Again, you can do a marginal analysis there of what's the value of the firm with a merger versus without a merger. And then finally, there are others, a whole bunch of other things. Be careful the way you use these, because I'm going to constantly say, well, if this is positive or if this is greater than, realize that in some instances, if you're looking at projects that you have to adopt one of several, and all of them have nasty numbers, all of them will cost us money, and none of them bring anything into the firm, then you're looking for the one that is the lesser of many evils, so to speak, as far as the value of the firm is concerned. And so be careful as you analyze these and make the appropriate adjustments to the rules as stated. So, capital budgeting basics. As was true when we looked at projecting the financial statements of the firm, the most critical and difficult item on the list is projecting sales appropriately. If sales forecasts are too low, the firm may not expand when it should and thereby lose market share. However, if your sales projections are a little too high, the firm may lock in higher payments than it can make, and that can increase the financial risk of the firm. And so we need to get these just right. It's sort of the too hot, too cold, or just right. It's sort of the Goldilocks problem. Because capital budgeting deals with long-term assets, which are best paid for by long-term financing, either debt or equity, they lock the firm into long-term capital commitments. And when they are locked into those long-term commitments, that detracts from having enough flexibility to next year when a new opportunity opens up. Oh, darn, I wish I could do that, but all of a sudden I can't because my flexibility has now gone away, which is one of the arguments for what some people consider, and we're going to discuss right at the end of this chapter, the concept of capital rationing. The other concept that I need to point out right here is because capital budgeting deals with long-term assets, and we best pay for those with long-term financing, we're going to use as a discount rate or as a hurdle rate the weighted average cost of capital, which also looks at the cost of capital over the long run. At least that's going to be our baseline. If the project is a little more risky, there are ways of adjusting the discount rate for risk, either up or down. Now, before we get into this too much and say, here's how you would analyze these, let's talk about where you get the initial ideas from, because for a company to continue to exist, it has to be able to grow and sort of live, and this whole living idea, living, breathing organization, is it continually comes up with new projects and new ideas. So where do those capital budgeting expansion ideas or replacement of old equipment or new equipment for old equipment, where do those ideas come from? Best way of looking at this is if you're in a company for a while and you get to understand the product, the service, and the business processes that create those products and services, you can look at, first off, what's missing. What's missing is really looking at that market for goods and services and saying, what are we missing and what could we be doing to enhance what we currently do. For instance, Rocky Brands eventually did get into some clothing, like hunting clothes, because they were already selling hunting boots, and so they already had an established relationship with the channels, those marketing channels that would sell that kind of product. And so they're thinking, well, we could maximize what we already have by increasing the number of products we're selling through those same channels. That was what they may have seen as being missing, and then they fill that need. That's just understanding the demand for their products and services and understanding that market for those goods and services. You can look at what others are doing and say, and then ask yourself, does that make sense that we would do something similar? And some instances you're saying, well, does it make sense that we do something similar but different? That's kind of doing a little tweak on that and kind of using what other people are doing to brainstorm. So you can get together and say, what could we be doing that would improve the value of the firm? And then you come up with either new processes to reduce the cost, improve the processes to increase the sales, increase the products and services that are being offered. There's a whole bunch of different things that you can look at, but most of these would come through a brainstorming session. And the best way of doing this is across disciplines. So people usually put themselves into different silos. I am a marketing person, but marketing people need to understand finance. Finance need to understand marketing. And as we get into these different areas and start broadening our thought process, we can come up with some really creative ways of increasing the value of the firm to our shareholders by finding out the things that would be missing or ways that we could improve. The last area that we could look at is ask our customers. So what do you wish we offered in the way of products or services? And ask our employees. The employees can look both at the products and services. Many of them may have closer connections with our customers than maybe we do. And our employees certainly understand the business processes that are running the business currently and may be able to offer suggestions of how we can improve. So once we have these projects all lined out, the question is, we have a list of things that we could possibly be doing now. How do we decide which ones to approach and which ones to take on? How do we prioritize that? Well, we have several techniques that we're going to be talking about throughout this chapter. Net present value, internal rates of return, payback periods, discounted payback periods, modified internal rate of return, profitability index. And the question is, we're going to have way too many of these analysis tools. How do we know which one to use and which one is the best one to use? Let's look at the criteria of these tools. How do we decide which one is the best? We need to ask ourselves the following questions when we look at these decision tools and the criteria that they bring. Number one, does the decision rule based on that tool adjust for the time value of money? Number two, does that decision rule based on that tool adjust for risk? Number three, does that decision rule based on that capital budgeting tool? I know it rhymes, but yeah, I'm not doing that to annoy you. It just is the best way of conveying. So deal with it. So does the decision rule based on that particular tool provide information on whether we're creating value for the firm, for our shareholders? If the answer to all of those is yes, it's a really powerful tool. If the answer is no, then it might add some value, but it's probably not the best tool we could use. With that introduction, let me jump right into net present value. The philosophy of net present value is it's trying to calculate how much the adoption of a new project will have on the overall value of the firm. It's asking the best question I can think of asking, which is, how does this impact the value of the firm for my shareholders? Net present value is therefore the sum of all the outlays in present value terms. Now, for this to work, what we're going to have to do is say, if I actually invest money, the money's leaving my pocket, therefore it's a negative. And so I enter it in as a negative, and I find the present value of that negative, and it will retain that negative number. Then the inflows are all listed as positives. The net represents the addition to value of the firm over that time period. I'll show you in a minute. So how much value is created from undertaking an investment? Well, first step in the net present value process is to estimate the expected future cash flows. Second, we're going to estimate the required return for the projects of this risk level. So we're going to start with the weighted average cost of capital, and if we have to, we'll adjust it. This chapter we're certainly not going to be adjusting it because we're just learning these techniques. And then the third step is to find the present value of the cash flows and subtract the initial investment. We're really not subtracting it because it's a negative already. Even the present value of it is a negative. So if we just add them all up, the negatives and the positives together will be then we'll look at what the net present value of the cash flows is, and that's really what we're trying to do. Let me give you an example. This is a stupid example that I made up, okay? So as the Chief Financial Officer of Spamway Corporation, which by the way is a multi-level marketing company that sells processed meats to the ultimate consumer, although most people get into selling the program rather than the actual product. Anyway, you have been presented with the following two potential projects. Assume a 9% discount rate. Now, before I show it, I'm going to point out that I made up this example many years ago when I was still way into theory of this, that, and the other, and that meant that I ended up having a whole bunch of Greek letters rolling around in my head, and so we end up with Project Gamma and Project Psi, okay? Deal with that. So Project Gamma, just to interpret what these numbers are all about, in time 0, that's now, is going to cost me $1,500. In time period 1, it's expected to generate $450. In time period 2, $460. In time period 3, $470. Time period 4, $480. And then time period 5, $490. With Project Psi, we're going to start off investing out of pocket $3,000, and then the money starts coming back at $755, $855, $955, and so on. I think you get the gist of this. So that's what I'm just wanted to clarify that. Let me show you what this looks like in the steps that I've outlined. Then I'm going to show you how to do it in Excel. So here we go. Net present value example 1. This is Project Gamma. So my steps look like this. I draw my cash flow timeline so I can see what's going on. I put in my numbers and my discount rate. I'm assuming in this instance that my weighted average cost of capital is 9% and that this project is no more or less risky than every other project that I have in my firm. At this point, I need to discount every single cash flow to the time 0 level. Well, the negative 1,500 is already in time 0 terms. For 50, if I discount it at 9% for 1 year, is 412.84. 462 years is 387.17, and so on, and so on, and so on. Then when I add all of those together, the negative 1,500 with the positive cash flows that follow in present value terms, I sum them, they become 32145. It feels like I'm counting backwards and then forwards where I started. It's kind of weird, because if we turned the 4, 5 around, put them on the front, it would be 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. But anyway, that's just me. I'm just being a nerd here, okay? So the net present value is $321.45. That's in today's dollars. It's like, how much did I make in today's dollars, accounting for my cost of capital? And by the way, if this is a new project and I'm trying to do this to enhance the value of to my shareholders, I need that to be at least a positive number. Now let's look at example for Project Psi. Again, we're going to draw our timeline, put in the numbers, the dollars, and then we're going to put in the cost of capital, which in this case is 9%. Again, we're not assuming that this is any more or less risky than my regular projects for my company. I take my 755 discount at 1 year, my 855 discount at 2 years, and so on, and so on, and so on. Add them up, and by that way, the last two. The second to the last one rounds to 747. The last one does as well, which makes me think I want to go on a trip and get on a 747. But anyway, we'll add them all up, 3,000 plus all of those positive numbers. We end up with 643.83, or rounds to 644. I'm only pointing that out because I know where we're going with this. So having done this for both of these, let me show you how to do this in Excel. The easy way, And then the way that will look a lot like this, where we do them all individually and sum them, just so you can see that we're getting the same numbers, okay? To save ourselves some time, I have already preloaded these numbers into my spreadsheet. The easiest way of handling this, by the way, is first off writing at the bottom weighted average cost of capital, telling it that this is now 9, if I can ever find my 9.00%. Moving down a couple and then saying, what is the net present value? And this one should be a lot more straightforward in Excel than it turns out to end up being. So what I'm going to say is equal net present value. So far that's pretty easy to remember, NPV. First thing that it wants us to input is the rate. This is the discount rate, and because I'm going to be copying this over 1 and I don't want it to go into a negative or into a blank cell, I'm going to hit an F4 key to hold the dollar sign, put a dollar sign in front of the B and the dollar sign in front of the 9. Then I'm going to say comma, and this is where things get a little flaky. We're not going to start with the times 0 cash flow, because that's not the way net present value works. We have to start with the time 1 cash flow, whatever that is, whether it's negative or positive. It assumes the first number is for time period 1 and the second number is for time period 2, and so on. So I'm going to then close my parenthesis and add the time period $0. NPV will convert all of those into time $0, but it doesn't assume that any of them are already there. So then we'll have to add the times $0 to the argument, so it's a little messy. I wish it weren't that way, because when we do all the other ones, we just highlight everything, and I'm going, that feels so inconsistent. But anyway, that's the way we do it. I'm going to hit enter. We get 321. Let me expand that just a hair. Wow, maybe not. There we go. And now I'm going to pull that one across just by 1, and we get the same answers, 321.45 and 644.83. Okay, the other way of doing net present value, by the way, is highlighting these just so you can see how this works, so that it looks more like what we did in the PowerPoint. I'm going to grab those and then do our formula of present value for each one of these. I'm going to say is equal to that number, whatever is over 3 cells, divided by parenthesis. I'm now going to discount it, 1 plus my discount rate. I'm going to use this one cell over and over and over again, no matter where I am, so I'm going to have to hit F4. And then close parenthesis, do an exponent which looks at whichever time period I'm on right now, which means we have to hold the column constant, which means I hit F4 until I get the dollar sign in front of the A. So I get my cash flow discounted at the discount rate, 1 plus the discount rate, raised to the time period. I hit enter. I'm going to format this one really quickly. Let me do all, and then I'm going to move over, widen that one, and bring it down. You'll notice my 740s, my 747 and my 747. So I'm going to come down here and then sum. So I'm going to say equal sum. We're going to sum all of that, close parenthesis, enter. Note, same number. Copy across, same number. How do we know, based on this, whether or not we should adopt? If the NPV is positive, and if this alternative does not preclude a different alternative, then the answer is we accept the project. If it precludes another one, then we would take whichever one has the highest net present value, because we're trying to maximize the value of the firm. A positive NPV means that the project is expected to add value to the firm and will therefore increase the wealth of the owners. Since our goal is to increase owner wealth, NPV is a direct measure of how well this project will meet our goal of maximizing shareholder wealth. So let's take a look at NPV as a decision tool using our decision criteria. So first, does the NPV rule account for the time value of money? Answer is yes, because it takes into account that discount rate, which has embedded in it the time value of money and the risk. So number 2, does the NPV rule account for the risk of the cash flows? And I already hinted at that one, and I did that on purpose actually, because I knew this was the next question. Does the NPV rule account for the risk of the cash flows? The answer is yes, because we can adjust that discount rate to adjust for the risk of these cash flows. Third, does the NPV rule provide an indication about the increase in value? Yes, that's actually the function of net present value, is it's saying how much more is the firm worth if we adopt the project. Should we consider the net present value for our primary decision criteria? Only if we said yes to all of the above. Let's see, yes, and yes, and yes. So the answer here is yes. We should consider the net present value rule for our primary decision criteria. Maybe this is where we should start. Before we make that decision a final decision, let's take a look at the other tools and techniques. The first one we're going to consider is something that used to be like the primary thing that they did back in the 1960s. It's called payback period. With payback period, we're really trying to measure the time it takes to recoup the initial investment. We're not taking into account the time value of money. By the way, if you were wondering why they did this in the 1960s, remember 1960s is BC. I don't mean 1960 BC. I mean it's before computers and it's before calculators, and therefore it's BC. So this is before calculators and computers were big, and then payback period was much easier for most people to handle. I'll show you why in a minute, because you can do it on the back of an envelope, so to speak. The quicker the payback period, smaller the number, the better, and most companies has to be paid back within this number of periods. So they give you a threshold that you had to beat, and you had to beat it by getting a smaller number. So to calculate payback period, you'd follow these 4 steps. These 4 steps I made up, so bear with me, and the last one looks more complicated than it is, so I'll talk you through it intuitively, and hopefully that one, either way, will help, hopefully. So here we go. Steps. Number 1, create a cash flow timeline. We've been doing that anyway, and you've already seen all of these in my example in a cash flow timeline. Second, add another line for cumulative cash flow. We're just going to sum what's happened thus far. Third, identify the last year that cumulative cash flow is negative. Now this may not make a lot of sense to you now, but it will in a second. So we'll call that time period A. We're not calling the cash flow A, we're calling the time period A. Fourth, payback period should then be calculated with the following formula, which looks nastier than it is. Its payback period is equal to the last negative cumulative cash flow time period, however many years, plus however many is still the cumulative cash flow at that time period, which is still going to be negative. That's why we have to do the absolute value around it. And then we're going to divide that by just the periodic cash flow for the next period. Let me give you the example that we've already run with projects Gamma and Psi, and then I'm going to show you how awkward this is to do in Excel. So here we go. Yeah, this is the same story. We have our Spamway, our Project Gamma, our Project Psi, and these are exactly the same cash flows, okay? Nothing up my sleeve. This is not tricky. I'm trying to show you how to analyze the same sets of numbers. So, example 1. Here are my 4 steps. Number 1, create the cash flow timeline and fill it with the cash flows. 1500, 450, 460, and so on. We do keep the signs. So we have a negative 1500 because it's an outflow, and a 450 and 460 and 478, 480, 490, all positives because they're inflows, they're net inflows, and therefore the step 2 is create a cumulative, which means we say we invested 1500, so it's negative 1500. At time period 1, that's the negative 1500 plus the 450. That's what's happened so far, which gives me 1050. Then I take my 1050, which is negative, add positive 460, which leaves me with 590. And then with 590, negative 590, I add 470. I'm now up to negative 120 in time period 3. Then negative 120 plus 480 will give me a positive number, so my last negative year is year 3. That's step 3. Last negative year is year 3. 3, therefore, becomes A. The number 3 is A. That's the 3 for the year. Step 4, we throw it through this formula, which confuses people to death because all we're looking for, though, is the year in which we find our last negative. That's 3, plus what the cumulative cash flow is that same year. That's the negative 120. We take the absolute value of 120 and divide that by the total cash flow in the following year. That would be year 4. And so we're saying, how far through year 4 do we get before we've come down to 0? Well, if we get these cash flows on a regular enough basis, it's 120 is exactly 1/4 of the way through year 4, because 120 divided by 480 is 1/4. So it's 3 1/4 years. The 3 for the 3 years that it took us, the 1/4 for 1/4 of the way through year 4. I'm hoping that makes sense. I can't use my hands. I can use my hands. It's just you can't see them. So I'm hoping that works for you. If it doesn't, we're going to try it one more time with Project Psi. So step 1, draw the timeline and put in the numbers for the cash flows. Make sure we have the negative for the outlay and the positives for the inflows. Second, we accumulate them. In other words, in year 1, we do negative 3,000 plus 750, which is 2245, and so on. The last negative in this instance is the negative 435, which is in time period 3 again. And so we're going to take the negative 435. First off, we're going to say 3 plus negative 435, absolute value of that. So we're just going to take 435 divided by 1054, which is going to be 3.41 years. Now, having done this way, I'm going to have to show you how awkward this is to do in Excel. Now we're looking at the payback period. I'm going to have to highlight my labels in the column. I'm going to actually then paste, and because I don't really need these to be seen right now, I'm going to highlight those 3 columns, right mouse button, and tell it to hide them. Now they're still there. You can see we go A, B, C, D, H, I, J. You're going, what happened to E, F, G? And the answer is they're hidden. Don't tell anyone. So at this point, I'm going to just start from scratch and essentially do this whole payback period thing, which means we have our timeline 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it goes sideways. We have now the cash flows. Now I'm going to do the cumulative cash flows. And the cumulative cash flows are just looking at the outlay first. Then I'm going to copy over. Then I'm going to say the second row looks like this. It's going to look at the cash flow thus far, and it's going to add the stuff that's added this time period. And so I am going to pull that one over, and then I'm going to pull that one down. And then I'm going to move down here and say this is payback period. So let's call it payback period. And let's uncenter that one so we can actually see the whole word. And then we're going to say equals, and this one we have to actually look at. So we're saying which of these is my last negative. Oh, it's this one. So I go over to the 3. It's not the negative 120 right now that's the most important. It's the time period. Then I'm going to say plus absolute ABS. This says abs. Anyway, and we'll look at the 120 now because it's the cumulative cash flow that year divided by the actual cash flow for the following year. So we're looking at how far through that time period did we get before we paid it off. I'm going to hit enter. Now, the big problem with this is you can't just copy it across. You actually have to think through it, and that's one of the big problems with this particular technique. So I'm going to say equals, and again I'm looking down here for the last negative. I'm going all the way over to the time period, and I'm going to say plus absolute. I go back to that one that I've highlighted in time, go all the way back over to the cumulative cash flow first, close parenthesis, divided by, go down one and move all the way over to the individual cash flows and say enter, and we get our 341. These are the same numbers that I had on the slides, just trying to point that out. How good a job does this one do as far as our criteria are concerned? Well, first off, does the payback rule account for the time value of money? No. We didn't actually use 9% in there at all. Does the payback rule account for the risk of the cash flows? You want to initially say, since it doesn't include the discount rate, it doesn't, but it can to a certain extent because it's looking at liquidity. It's looking at how quickly do we get paid back, and in a way it's taking into account our inability to project cash flows out very far. And so in some ways it takes into account a little of the risk, but not a very large portion of it. Does the payback rule provide an indication about the increase in value to the shareholder? No, and especially since we don't have a discount rate. So even if it does pay back sometime during that time period, I don't know if it does that adjusting for the time value of money. So the answer is no, kind of a little bit, and then no. So we have a no, a kind of a little bit, and a no. So the question is, should we consider the payback rule for our primary decision criteria? No, net present value did a whole bunch better just because it was a yes, yes, and yes, not a no, sort of, kind of, no. No, that's not it. So payback is not the best. Are there some advantages and disadvantages to payback? Yeah, advantages, it's easy to understand. It adjusts for uncertainty of later cash flows. It's biased toward liquidity. The more likely you are to accept this, the more liquid you're going to be. Disadvantages, though, are it ignores the time value of money. It requires some arbitrary cutoff point that we don't even understand because nobody actually explained it to us. And even if they did, it probably wouldn't make any sense. And then finally, it ignores cash flows beyond whatever time period we said. So for instance, at the 3.25 years, every cash flow beyond 3.25 is irrelevant. We could have, $20 trillion after that, and it would just completely ignore it. And finally, it's biased against long-term projects, which is really the same thing. It's ignoring everything beyond that point. And so if we're looking at longer-term paybacks, such as things for research and development and those sorts of things, this criteria doesn't use any of that as inputs. So to adjust a little bit, let's take a quick look at discounted payback period. With discounted payback period, we're going to adjust the payback period for the time value of money. Now, when you do that, you can make some adjustments for risk. Still, the quicker the payback period, even the discounted payback period, the better. So the smaller the number, the better. To calculate payback period or discounted payback period, wow, I should have put discounted payback period on all of these. We're going to follow the following 5 steps. First, create a cash flow timeline. That's the same thing as we did before. Second, convert cash flow to present value. Ooh, we didn't do that one. Third, add a line for cumulative present value cash flow. This is just the same thing. We're doing a cumulative, but we're not doing it on the actual cash flow. We're doing it on the present value of the cash flow. 4, identify the last year that the cumulative present value cash flow is negative, so it's really the same thing. We'll call it, A. Then the payback period is calculated using a very similar formula, but it just looks nasty because we have extra little thingies in there. But it's the same thing. We're just operating off of the line for the cumulative present value of cash flows. And so here's what this looks like with our example. So again, same example, same spamway, same projects, gamma and psi, okay? And so as we apply these, we're going to be looking at example 1. There are my cash flows. Step 1, there are our cash flows. Step 2, there are the present values of our cash flows. Step 3 is summing them up to this point. So instead of doing the negative 1500 plus 450, we're doing the negative 1500 plus the 413. And then that's going to be equal to the negative 1087. We take the 1087, the negative 1087, and add to that 387, which gives us negative 700, etc. Then we keep going until we get our last negative. Our last negative is that negative 337, and we're going to be paying that just barely in year 4, because 337 is how much we have left to pay back, and we get a 340, which makes it just barely positive. So the last year for which we have a negative is year 3. And then we do the same thing that we did before. We say negative 337, take the absolute value of that, so it's just 337 divided by 340, which gives us the 399, or 3.99 years, approximately 4 years even. Now the project psi. Project psi, step 1, same as before. Timeline, negative 3000 up through 1150, positive. Now we need to take all of those and their present values. There are 2 747s there, you'll note. Then we're going to take the cumulative. Now I'm going to point out something that I should have pointed out last time, and that's that cumulative in the last time period is our net present value, 644. Now, as we're moving our way across this time, the last negative, last negative year is 4. Then we're going to say 4 plus the negative 104, the absolute value of negative 104 divided by 747 gives me the 4.14 years. Now let me show you how awkward this one is to do in Excel. Again, we're going to have to do a lot of the same stuff that we did for payback period with this one. Now again, I'm going to start this the same way. Get my headings, copy, paste, and I'm going to hide these two. Hide. And I'm going to be first off so I'm looking at my 5 steps. My first step is the timeline, which is sideways again, and the cash flows, which are there. Second, get the present value. Now we've already done this when we did the extra little things for period by period for my net present value. We've already done. So in this instance, I'm going to do it a little bit different because there are many ways to accomplish the same thing in Excel. So I'm going to say equal present value, open parenthesis, it wants the interest rate, so I'm going down and showing it. We're going to discount it at this rate. Because I'm going to be using this all the way through, I'm going to copy it here, there, and everywhere. I'm going to have to hit the F4. Now the N per, number of periods. Make sure that we're in the same row, and make sure that we use F4 until we get the $ in front of the A. Comma, payment, we don't want a payment. And then for the future value, because we want the same sign out, we're actually going to have to hit negative and then the actual cash flow. Close parentheses. So if you want to do the PV method, you don't have to do anything fancy, but you have to kind of think through it. You do equal PV, make sure we get the weighted average cost of capital, and we hold that one constant. Get the time period, hold the column constant, ignore the payment, so we're putting a comma, and you can either put a 0 or you can just put the next comma and it will realize that's a 0. And then put the negative cash flow. And I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to pull this one over 1, widen the column, and then move it down. And again, we have our 747 rounding up and our 747. Okay, these are the present values, and if we summed them down here, we'd end up with the net present value. I'm going to want to move next door because I'm not finished now. I need to do the cumulative, so I'm moving next door, copying the headings and pasting, widening out just a hair, and then saying, okay, I want, first off, we're going to be doing these as cumulative, so there's my first one, and I could copy over, but if I do them this way, it widens my column, so I'm just going to start from scratch because it's just as easy. At this point, I'm going to say equal what it was before plus my present value of cash flow now. Enter. I'm going to move this one over and pull them down. I'm going to first off point out that this set right here is exactly equal to those two numbers. That's your check figure at this point. We did that part right. Those appear to be correct. And so I'm going to move down here and say, well, I'm going to do the discounted payback period. I know I'm on the same row, and I really haven't said anything about discounted, but that's what I'm doing. You know what I'm doing. Anyway, I'm going to therefore go equal. What's the last one that's negative? This one. This is actually nicer because it actually is giving me the color cue. So I'm going to say that one plus same row for cumulative. Oops, I forgot my absolute. So absolute, the abs, showing its abs. And then close parenthesis, and divide by, we're going to move down 1 and over to actual cash flows and say enter. Now I'm going to, whoops, I forgot to do this. Let me do this really quickly and just do the comma, and it will actually put the 2 decimal points as a default. So I'm moving next door and saying is equal to. And in this instance, it's this row that has the last negative, and so I'm going to go all the way over to A to begin with, plus abs. Yeah, I'm trying to sound like Arnold Schwarzenegger. And then I'm going over to, sorry, I speak German, so that's the actual way you say that name anyway. Then we're getting the last cumulative, and then divided by the actual number for the following year. And then we enter, and we get the 4.14 that we did in the slideshow. So how good a decision tool is discounted payback period? The discounted payback rule does it account for the time value of money? Yeah, actually it does, because we've actually taken that into account. Does the discounted payback rule account for the risk of the cash flows? It takes more into account because, again, we're focusing on liquidity again. We're looking at how quickly we get paid back. And with a discount rate, we can adjust that discount rate for risk. So to a certain extent, and more than the regular payback period, the discounted payback period does account for a little more risk, although, again, we're not including all of our cash flows. So does the discounted payback rule provide an indication about the increase in value? No, because we're not including everything. Even though in our working of it, we can actually end up with the net present value at the end, it doesn't actually take into account the increase in value at all. Therefore, should we consider the discounted payback rule for our primary decision criteria? The answer is no. This is a good place to stop, by the way. So I'm going to stop here, and then the next video we're going to pick it up by talking about internal rates of return and some other things. So I'll see you in the next video.